Hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing great. Today, the question that we're going to deal with is about whether canonization of drama is possible. Now, when we talk about the canonization of drama or of any genre for that matter, there are certain questions that underlie it that are very significant. Firstly, when we talk about canonization, what are the processes that canonization as an act enables, or what are the processes that uh, that canonization propels, and why do we need canonization of literature in the first place, or what are the needs that bring us to the canonization of literature. We're going to start with these questions and then see about how these apply to drama and how these could be influencing how and what we understand of drama as a genre and as an activity as such. Firstly, I'd like to ask you all to think about and start with this quotation that Camelia Nelson begins one of her essays with for the conversation. She says that literature is a dense network of cultural allegiances and class beliefs. Now, this is a very important statement, and it's a very uh, accurate statement if we think about a lot of things. So, literature as a network of cultural allegiances and class beliefs. What are the functions that literature has, and to what effect is literature put to use? Now, this again brings us to the questions about what constitutes literature as such, and what are the purposes behind writing or creation of literature. It is only then probably that we can go into what are the functions that it works for as the reader perceives it. Now, the main thing about this, the major factor about this, is that literature does not exist in a vacuum, or any of our experiences, in fact, or representations and conversations about our experiences, in fact, none of those seem to exist in a vacuum. And the moment we try to place them in a vacuum and study them, as was the purpose of literature earlier, to negate a political context or a social and cultural context or an economic context, and study them in isolation in terms of form or autotelic elements. What are the consequences of reading literature in that manner? Is an important question we have to think about. Uh, a work of art or a work of literary art is created, if it is created from imagination. We must again think about where imagination comes from. If it comes from human experience, or is it possible for us to think about or imagine something that does not exist, that we never encountered? Uh, we often think that it is possible for us, and that's why imagination works, because it is possible for us to perceive in imagination a lot of things that we do not have in reality. But again, uh, aren't the things that we understand and we perceive in our imagination somehow grounded in reality, in the sense that there are parallels of it in reality such that we can perceive it in our imagination? And if literature starts, uh, has its roots there from imagination or from human experience, does human experience itself exist in a vacuum? If that, if it exists in a vacuum, then how, there is supposed to be, if it exists in a vacuum, there is supposed to be an omniscient, an omnipresent, and an all-knowing viewpoint as such of everything that is happening in that particular work of art. But the more we read through it, the more we realize that isn't the case most of the times. Even the omniscient narrator or omniscient third person narrator that some works employ, even that person does not seem to have, or that narration does not seem to have a complete viewpoint. There is always some element of it that either gets left out or is simply not perceived, for the simple reason that we do not know, or there is no way we could know about all the aspects that go into that particular the creation of that particular narrative. In that case, what are the allegiances or the cultural allegiances that literature holds itself accountable to? Who are the cultural players into whose narratives or into whose perspectives or worldviews literature works into, or literature adapts itself to, or pledges allegiance to. And the second question about the class beliefs, again, for the same experience that it does not exist, that we do not exist in a classless society, and that the class distinctions uh, are both an economic and political reality of our societal structure as such, it becomes very difficult for us. It would be very difficult for us to perceive or to assume that literature can be apart from class beliefs, and therefore literature is apart is very much influenced by and consequently influences several aspects of class beliefs. These do not necessarily work in a very linear fashion. They do not work from something that is very acknowledged, or a sort of awareness, and in a sense that it furthers a propaganda or something of that sort. But by the nature of our experiences, by the very influence these things have on our experiences, and in turn form our perception that we consider to be aloof and away from everything else, that the whole staunchly subjective perspective that we talk about. The influence that these things have on our perspective itself can determine how we either write or read literature, or how we perceive a work of literary art, and how that in turn becomes a form of cultural allegiance and class belief, or reflects a form of cultural allegiance and class belief. Now, when we connect this to the next thing, it's about the question of the subjective and the creation, I would say, of the objective. What exactly is this uh, objective reality, or objective meaning, or objective opinion that we often talk about? Because canonization often alludes to that there is a list of works which need to be given that significance, which need to be treated in such and such manner, which can be set as a benchmark for the rest of the literary works to be compared with. Now, what is the problem that we face with this benchmark, and where does this benchmark come from? Is there really naturally a kind of objective benchmark that is there? Is one work of literature truly, is it possible to say that this is truly better than that? And if we say this is truly better than that, what exactly do we mean by better there? What are the standards and who set them? Now, this who becomes a very important question when we come to this particular uh, idea of education, or of authority, or any of the postmodern subjects, any of the postmodern ways in which we look at these ideas. Because, again, as we said, we're not talking about things in a vacuum. There is a very specific origin for these things. And when there is an origin, and there is a conscious origin of these things, there is definitely an end that they are looking forward to. So subjectivity, in a manner, there is someone very rightly said that the only thing, the only thing that two people, so I'm paraphrasing, the only thing that two people who like a work of literary art or a book seem to agree upon is that they like it. So the more they do go into the details of the nitty-gritties of it, or not even nitty-gritties, perhaps they talk about characterization, or they talk about the way the plot, or they talk about why they like that particular work, or they dislike that particular work. The moment that conversation happens, we see that that illusion of objectivity crumbles. There is there might be conflict, there might be disagreements about why that happens, why there is why they like that particular thing. So that's where subjectivity emerges, I feel. So how do we come to this objective, and what are the purposes that this objective or supposedly objective viewpoint holds? Now, for a long time, and when a society comes together, and there is a belief that it has to, it can't go into anarchy, there has to be a system that binds it together in a way. So because it has to be bound together, there needs to be an objective, there needs to be actually a consensus, or the likelihood of a consensus about how the society is going to be governed, what are the aesthetics that the society is going to function on, and what are the cultural factors that the society is going to consider morality, and what should a member of an ideal member of the society do or not do. When these questions emerge, the subjective viewpoints, obviously, because if you think about it, if you ask that question to anyone, they'd say, "Oh yeah, you can live your own life." This is a statement that most people make, that you can live your own life as long as you don't hurt someone else. Now, how would we define not hurting someone else? Are we going to define it in terms of did you kill someone else? Are you going to define it in terms of did you emotionally, hurt someone? Or and if we say emotionally hurt, what are the intensity? What is the benchmark that we are setting there? What is the threshold that we are setting there? So these are the things uh, that give us that make us think about the objective uh, objective perspective as such, and how there are different threads, as you would have noticed as we were having this conversation about, there are different threads from several subjective viewpoints that are taken together and bound together to form this kind of and form and present this kind of an objective reality, or an objective meaning, objective morality. uh, this objective then goes on to influence a lot of narratives, that and it sort of becomes the way in which these narratives are further. Now, what is the effect this has? If my version or my subjective understanding of something does not figure in the way I put it forward in this objective picture, this objective picture is going to the classrooms, it's going to the mass media, it's going to the creation of the narrative of that society itself. Then when I do not have access to that narrative in terms of how I'm interacting with that narrative, who will tell that story that I'm supposed to be telling? Or how am I communicating what I want to communicate? How do I make sure of that? And can I make sure of that? And if someone cannot hear my side of the story, or cannot hear my side of the story as I say it, is there a possibility that the problems or the concerns or anything that I want addressed will ever find some sort of resonance, will ever find communication at all? And this is one of the questions that we want to bear in mind when we go forward with canonization, the conversation about canonization as well. For this purpose, I would like you to think, for the purpose of this video, we'll be taking the examples of Shakespeare for proscenium theatre, and we'll be taking street theatre as the opposite. And this is the kind of comparison I want to make when we talk about the canonization of drama. Now, when we talk about that, there is, when I say two these two forms of these two uh, styles of presentation of drama itself, you can sort of get an idea about how objective is the objectivity in terms of aesthetics has functioned in this plane inside a classroom at least, and how certain times that has had an impact on how we define certain works of art, or how we talk about certain works of art, and how we further conversations about them. Now, as we go further into this, I'd like I'd like you to think about the canonization, the aspect of canonization in relation with cultural transportation. By cultural transportation, I mean, how did a canonized work of art, canonized work of literary art, such as Shakespeare, come to be so widely accepted in so many parts of the world, especially so many parts of the colonized world? What makes it stick? What is the factor that makes it stick? Now, there is the one reason, the one understanding that's usually given, the one reason that's usually given is that Shakespeare has a sort of universality, and that universality is not found in mostly in any other writer. Now, how do we understand this universality? Is universality, or can universality be just another word for the question of the objective? Is it possible for any art that is locally produced, that has local influences because it does not arise from a vacuum? Is it possible for it to have a sort of uh, a sort of universality? And by universality, if we mean it's the innate human nature portrayed in a work of art, what is innate in the first place, and what is this innate human nature that is so universal, that has, we must understand it as having no cultural influences, that is uh, unique to its context? And don't all works of art in that sense portray it, if that this is the case of emotions, or this is the case of how it strikes a chord with the human self, don't all works of art essentially tend to do that, or don't we understand works of art in general to be tending to do that? If that is the case, then how did this particular work of literary art, or this particular uh, understanding of it, gain this so-called universality, and why were the others left out? And how did it come? How did it reach so widely into the colonized picture? Now, if we take the example of several of these early portrayals, early Indian adaptations of Shakespearean plays, we can see this thing, that a a sort of exclusivity of access that is given to Shakespearean plays in the start, because these are plays that are brought by these colonial, or these men who work for in work for the colonial government, and these are men who are staying men as in the families who are staying very far from very far from their families, or from their context as such, from their socio-political context as such, and they are in a land that is alien to them, that speaks alien languages. In this context, it is a piece of home that they brought forward from there. But as this piece of home has due to very political, racial, and linguistic hegemony in us, or not hegemony, actually, in a the dominance in a way, the elitism in a way, it has been kept exclusive. There is an exclusivity of access in that term. So, taking up that particular language, or that particular form of art, or that particular playwright, and doing it working on it in your own context, becomes a sort of uh, a question of prestige, a question of how you're countering this cultural exclusivity. In that case, can we think about the adaptation or adoption of this particular uh, idea of Shakespeare, or of those playwrights that were brought in such a way? Can we understand the adoption of them as a sort of exposition necessitated by the political context? Is there that sense of a political context to that picture? And if there is, then what do we understand of the universality that has been proclaimed? So this is something that again we need to think about, and how this has affected the canonization in today's context, not in the context of their the education system put in place by the English, but in today's context, when we talk so much about decolonizing that particular system of education, what are its implications now? In a way, this particular attempt to decolonize, attempt to create a decolonized society in this aspect, creates a sort of Talibanian dilemma, because it has been practiced for so long and so vehemently that today it is difficult to discern which part of it stays relevant to today's context, because so much has evolved with it over time, and which part of it is essentially a sort of colonial continuation. So these are the questions that canonization uh, prompts us to think about. The next thing is about, of course, when we talk about drama as a genre or theatre as a genre, what is it that we can talk about this genre and permanence? Because as canonization, as all the others, as with all the others genres of canonization, these regard to these are these relate to how these relates to how we understand drama and theater. These all these when the question of canonization arises, it's about the enduring nature of that form or of that form, or the enduring nature of that um, particular piece of literary art. But when it comes to theater, which is the performance space of drama, is does anything endure at all? Because one of the factors with theater is that it is continually interpreted, and even in the most staunchly traditional representations of this drama, we see that it is not entirely it does not it cannot stay the same from performance to performance. So it keeps evolving, it keeps changing from performance to performance. And in that case, what is it that uh, I mean, how is it even possible for us to canonize drama and to say that a piece of drama, which is meant for theater, which is meant for the performance space that constantly evolves, is stagnant over time, is to say that it does not make a good play. And if it does not make a good play, why is it canonized in the first place? And why do we have that sense of a permanence? Why do we attribute that sense of a permanence to these forms? The next question, as we talked about, why is it even canonized? If we can talk about the keeping something permanent or making something endure over a long period of time, we can also think about the function that it serves, in, not just in terms of drama, but in all terms, all forms of literary art that are canonized. What is the uh, political or the social or economic reality that it seeks to further? And in this case, we could talk about class consciousness because, as we said in the very beginning, uh, it is literature is a set of cultural allegiances and class beliefs. So, what is a class consciousness that exists in attributing this canonization to theater, which is mostly considered one of the most democratic forms of art there is? So, class consciousness in this term becomes about why the proscenium, when it comes to canonization. Why are the plays of the proscenium and why are plays such as those of Shakespeare or other colonial writers given that kind of a stature, given that kind of an aesthetic superiority that is not associated with street theatre or forms or political forms of theatre as such? This is not exclusive to theatre in a way, but it is exclusive to all forms of canonization, so to say. So, what is this? What does this according with? What does this association with a purely aesthetic form of art uh, hand us? What is the reality that it hands us? What is the use that it hands us? Now, that class consciousness in theater gives us a sense of, uh, gives us is visible in the sense that when we attribute the aspects of purely aesthetic ideas, when we say that these ideas endure, these ideas reflect human tendencies, uh, we negate that straight theater is momentary, or forms like straight theater are momentary, or the concerns of straight theater are momentary because it relates to a struggle here, or an issue there, and it's purely very local, and it's very confined to that particular temporal dimension. We fail to acknowledge and thereby fail to take into account that these issues are enduring as such. So it is cutting off a particular narrative from the only possible angle from where such a conversation could have happened. Now, if we say street theater, if we canonize a work of street theater, we would have to acknowledge that there is in the concerns that street theater talks about an enduring meaning. And in that enduring meaning, we would have to acknowledge that the political context, the structure that puts it into place, which it calls to form or altogether replace, needs needs acknowledgement as well. This is not something that system that puts our education, or the current political or dimension, hegemonic dimension, can afford. And since it cannot afford that, so is that the reason why this permanence in theater, why street theater or other such forms are kept exclusive from this concept of permanence and aesthetic superiority or canonization as such? And as a consequence, how does this affect pedagogy? And how does pedagogy as such, or the form of education, or the allowance that these get in education as such, affect the greater question of how we understand and uh, perceive these narratives, and through them have some effective conversation about socio-political realities, and build towards something that can be, altered or changed in times to come. So these are some of the ideas I wanted to put forward. Now, if you have any other ideas about this, if there's a conversation you want further, if there's an idea you want to add or debate upon, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and we'll take that up in the next video or in the comments as such. So thank you very much. We'll see you in the next video. Thank you.